Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to chat with you guys a little bit about stance width and what muscles are worked when we squat. And the same thing can be applied to our belt squats. In theory, it could be applied to the leg press if you had a leg press that was big enough. So you guys will notice me using a variety of different stances here, and there's been different points in my training to where I use ultra wide squats. There's been points in my training where I use really narrow stance shoulder width squats, which you guys will see in some of the footage here, because all of this was taken in the same month, and all the maxes here are done very, very wide, just for those curious, like toes almost to the edges of the rack. Not quite as extreme as that box squat at the start, but you'll notice my different speed squats are different, and my belt squats are at different widths. And you can see there with that max, that's a really, really wide stance. So the question becomes, what's different about it? And the idea here is that I don't want to get into which one is necessarily stronger, because this really varies between people. The majority of people have more strength potential with a wide stance. For me personally, it doesn't seem to matter, right? It doesn't seem to matter at all. And I am possibly the odd man out, and there are definitely some people at the world level on squats who do a narrow stance. You know, just keep that in mind. So there's a lot of other factors involved in just particular muscle use. Could be for me because my quads grow well. Could be for me because of my hip angle. Maybe because I have really big hamstrings. I can bounce off of them easier. Who knows? Variety of factors. I personally don't see much strength difference, and have even had phases where the narrower seems a little stronger. So I'm actually pushing at the moment, and this may not be the case when this video comes out, of working with slightly narrower stances. But you guys will notice on that belt squat, notice how that looks in comparison to the narrow ones. So the most important thing to think about here is going to be the knee angle and muscles involved. All right, you always hear Louis Simmons used to say, wide transfers to narrow, and narrow doesn't transfer to wide. And I don't know that that's universally true, because there are a lot of people who train narrow and go wide and they're real strong. But he's probably talking about, you know, when you're at the 800 squat level. So the thing to remember is that the muscles worked are going to be a little bit different. So what do we mean? All right, when you go to a really wide stance, you are squatting more with the hips. All right, that means a little more hip extensor involved. When we go real wide, some of you may notice that the hip angle may be a hair deeper, but it's not necessarily, doesn't have to be deeper for this to occur. It also is affected by the width itself. So we get a little more hip extensor involved when you go wide in terms of muscle fiber recruitment. All right, so the wider the angle there, the more hip extension is involved. And so what does that mean? It means, well, the adductors, which is going to be the groin muscle, the abductors, which are going to be the smaller muscles up near the top of your hip on the outside. In theory, more glute. Some people will argue more hamstring, although I've not seen much evidence to that fact on the hamstring, you know, displayed in a lab. So I don't want that one to be taken to the bank, but it's potentially more glute. You know, and other hip extensors are a lot more involved. So we come over to the other question: what happens with narrower? It's a little more quad. You know, and when I say that, people will say, oh, I thought you said quads can be built with a wide stance. Well, they can. I've gone long periods of time without doing the narrow, and my quads are still big. Quads are still real big. And I would also argue that you don't need necessarily squatting movements to build the quads in a manner to let you squat with a wider stance, like sled drags and stuff will actually build it, because of the shallower knee angle involved anyways. So when we go narrower, why does it work more quad? Because studies have found that if knee angle is the same, it doesn't matter. That the amount of quad recruitment on any sort of squat movement pattern seems to be largely related to the amount of knee angle. But here's the problem. With a wide stance, you will almost never get the knee angles that you're capable of getting with the other stance, right? Because even when you break parallel, If you look at like 1 inch below parallel, just below parallel with either stance, go check it yourself. You could check it even on a box if you need to where you can pause it and see it. Your knee angle is going to be quite a few degrees deeper. Plus, a lot of times we can get a deeper depth in general. Even though the knee travels forward, you know, it's possible to get a deeper range of motion. So this is where we run into that conundrum for building muscle. Okay, because there's a little more muscles involved, and it's generally said that the wider stance has more potential for overall muscle growth. However, that doesn't mean quads. We're talking about, you know, hip extensor muscles, which if we break it down, all the muscles involved in hip extension are bigger than the quads. You know, when they're combined together, the quads are bigger. Glutes are the second biggest muscle in the body, by the way. Quads are the biggest. This is what studies on cadavers have found. But we're dealing with multiple muscles then. So yes, it has more potential for muscle mass, which may mean in theory it has more potential for strength. However, that's not always the case. It's not a guarantee. That's just looking at one element. When you factor in the quad involvement, and particularly the deeper stretch, the quads are lengthened at the bottom of a squat. Okay, and the more the knee bends, the more they're lengthened. Well, we come back over to what does the research show on hypertrophy? It shows that longer positions tend to have more hypertrophic potential, while in the quads, it's pretty significant when it's been studied. In other words, the amount of knee bend involved, so a lot of times they'll just study a standard squat and not change the stance, and they'll just study people at different levels of depth, and they find the deeper squats almost always build bigger quads. They almost always build bigger quads. So therefore, if quads are bigger and we get more quad involvement, well, that's a little different, isn't it? So what about the people who are stronger with a narrower stance? Well, it's people who have really, really strong quads. It's people who are able to generate more speed out of the bottom. All right, it's people who are able to generate more speed out of the bottom. What might that indicate? Certain hip structure angles, the ability to bounce off your hamstrings. So maybe you have really thick hamstrings that you can utilize against the sleeves or the knee wraps. Okay, well, that's possibly worth something. Or if you're just someone who you build more speed at those movement angles because maybe you have a slightly faster twitch fibers in your quads. Okay, that could be a genetic component that explains that, but ultimately narrower stance purely because of the knee angle involved. I want people to understand it is about the knee angles. Has more potential for quad activation, quad hypertrophy. The wider stance has more potential for activation of the hip extensors and hypertrophy of the hip extensors. Majority of people are going to be stronger wider. Some people are going to be identical, and a few people are going to be stronger with the narrow. But at the end of the day, strong is strong. If you're big and you have a thick lower body and you're strong, you'll be strong in both of them. All right, guys. Well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys next time.